G'day guys, Colour from Go Travel with Damo in Damo's garage, playing with the Raptor. What are we doing with the big girl today?
Well, it's got a bit of weight in the back. I've spring lifted it 2 inch in the front and it got an inch lift in the rear, but with the fridge and the hard lid and all that gear on it, it's actually sagging in the arse. So we're going to lift it up and put it on an inch spacer.
Okay, so the first lift that went in the Raptor Ranger, put 1 inch spacers in the front. Look, it's not the best way to lift them, but it got the job done initially. Obviously the front sat higher, so eventually changed over to springs. Now, like Damo said, the back sits down a little bit lower, so these spacers, because it's a coilover shock in the back, we're actually going to put these spacers on the back shock and see if we can get it sitting right. Working on car and jack stands, always just throw the tyre under just in case something does fail. Now, for those who haven't seen the rear suspension on a next Gen Raptor or any Raptor Ranger, it is actually a coilover shock assembly. So this is why you can put strut spacers on. I've already taken the nut off there, but basically all we're doing, take the wheels off, diff is to sit on the jack, then we're just going to lower the diff down, which will then fully extend the shock. Once it's fully extended, we'll take the bolts off the strut tops and then we'll lower it down. We'll be able to drop the whole shock out, put the strut spacer on.
There she goes.
Got the whole shock assembly out. Now this is your strut top sitting on top. What we're actually going to have to do is bolt this in, cut the tops off these bolts, then we need to spin the strut top. So these pins need to essentially line up where the old lineup is. So we've just trimmed up the studs and we're ready to Loctite the spacer on.
Watch your hands.
Now, just give it a clean up with the wire brush and then we're good to go. So you can see the factory strut top has now had the nuts trimmed, the spacer sitting on. We'll put some Loctite on the studs and on the nuts and we'll do them up and we're ready to put the shock back in. The strut spacer is now on top of the rear shock. We're just bolting everything back in. So massive bolt at the bottom. There is a locking nut on that, so make sure you get the nut the right way. We do have to re-plug the live valving in.
And we need to fix this.
And one thing we broke is the sensor for the live valving. So we need to work out how to unclip that when we do the other side, because we overextended that. We got a little bit smarter on this side. So the sensor for the live valving, literally 1 10mm bolt, unbolt that off the trailing arm, and that way you're good to go. So once you undo the bolts, the shock literally just slides down and forward. You've got to take the guarding off the shock guard, take that off, take the big shock bolt out, 3 bolts on the strut tower up the top on the strut hat, and you're good to go. Good to put the spacer on. All right, so we've got to spin the factory strut top. So put the standard nuts back on, so we've got something to lever off. Oh, hold on. Get a little bit further.
That's it?
Yeah, stop. Spacers are on both sides, everything's back in, plugs are clipped in. Actually, I need the side cutters, just going to cut these cable ties down. Yep. Dodged up a little mistake here for the time being with a couple of zip ties, so hopefully that pivots and works, but we'll see in a second. And we should be right to put the wheels back on and see how it finally sits. Alrighty, that's all buttoned up. We'll get it on some flat ground so we're going to have a look at it, but she's definitely sitting that inch higher, which is good. With the suspension, even though it's a 2-in-1 kit, so essentially 2 inch spring in the front and 1 inch spring in the back, what you'll find is with the fulcrum point in the front of these things, the springs are actually probably only a 1 inch spring anyway. So you imagine where my knuckles are, if you lift that 1 inch, my fingers actually move down 2 inches, which is what's happening to the lower control arm on these things. Anyway, let's get her out and have a look at her. Now we're sitting on flat ground. A bit hard to see, parked it in the shadows, but that is sitting much better. So it was very windy today, so I didn't get to film as much as I wanted to, didn't get to explain a lot of things that I would have liked to. First off, we'll just talk about Damo's Raptor and the suspension that's in it. So it's got aftermarket King springs on the standard factory shock, so it's a 2 inch lift in the front and a 1 inch lift in the back. Like I said, you'll find that both the springs are about the same height. Now I just want to explain that, and I'll use a couple of little props to explain this. So imagine that is your front lower control arm. Imagine that point is where your shock attaches, that point is where your wheel is, or where your hub is. So if you put a 1 inch spring, which gives you 1 inch lift, you'll see that the point is actually 2 inches. So therefore, a 1-inch spring in the front will give you 2 inches lift, thereabouts, somewhere around there. Whereas a 1-inch spring in the back is direct 1-for-1 because it's coil over the axle, so everything's just going straight down. There's no actual fulcrum point of it. I think fulcrum point's the right word. Anyway. When Damo first got the Raptor, he put 35s on it and then decided that he wanted to sit a little bit higher like the last one he had. So what he did is, at the time, there was actually no replacement springs, but we ended up putting a 1-inch spacer in the front. But then the ute had a bit of a Kelly lean on it and looked a bit silly. So once springs become available, we ended up buying some King springs for it, which is the 2-in-1, like I say, about the same length coil anyway. But took the strut spacers out the front, re-sprung it. But with the load lid, the fridge, the slide, the battery, and all the stuff that we put in it, what we found is it's still got a little bit of a squat in the back. This is when we decided to just have a go at putting the 1-inch spacers in the back and leveling it out. So being a 1-inch spacer, direct 1-for-1, so lifted the back the inch, and that's why we put the spacers in today. Now I know there's a lot of people out there thinking, why stuff with something that's already a good thing? Why lift it? Why put springs on a shock without revalving it? It's going to be in the wrong part of the stroke. Now these springs have been in Damo's Raptor for the better part of 3 months now. He's probably done about 20,000 Ks on it. And the feedback he's giving me is he doesn't notice the difference from standard. So don't get me wrong, I'm sure there is a difference, but it's just not that noticeable. At this point in time, it seems like it's an okay thing. It is worth pointing out though, since Damo sprung lift this, Mike's Shock Shop, they actually specialise in this high-end Fox shocks and things like that. They now actually re-valve and re-spring the standard Raptor Ranger next-gen live-valved Fox shocks. The cost of that is around 3K though, so it's a little bit expensive considering I think the springs cost about, I don't know, call it 500, 600 bucks. I think all up, sitting how we are, it's probably about 800 bucks to get the ute lifted how it is. Anyway, that's the next-gen Raptor Ranger on Fox live valve shocks with a spring lift, strut spacer in the rear, sitting at 2-inch all round. It's a bit hard to tell on video, but now the back sits just a touch high, which is good. So when it's loaded up with camping gear, it should hopefully sit level. And of course, today we were racing the clock and I forgot to bloody measure the thing. So I can't tell you the measurements hub to guard. Like I say, this is more just a sitting level thing, and that's how the Raptor's sitting right now. It's looking good. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Anything, feel free to comment below. If you like what you see, feel free to subscribe. And until next time, go travel.